At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan was no longer merely an emerging regional power. It had become a nation determined to compete with the world's great empires. After defeating Russia in 1905, the Japanese Empire understood that maritime dominance would be the key to both survival and expansion. It was within this climate of strategic ambition that Yamashiro, one of the most emblematic battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was born. Yamashiro was the second ship of the Fusō-class battleships, a class conceived as a direct response to the international naval arms race that preceded the First World War. Her keel was laid down in 1913 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. She was launched in November 1915 and officially commissioned in March 1917, already during World War I. From the outset, Yamashiro was a clear demonstration of power. Displacing more than 29,000 tons in her original configuration, she was armed with 12 356mm, 14-inch, main guns mounted in 6 twin turrets, an impressive arrangement for the time, representing Japan's determination to match the strength of Western naval powers. Her original design reflected the dominant naval thinking of the era: decisive fleet engagements between battleships, where range and firepower would determine victory. Yamashiro was built to serve within Japan's battle line, operating alongside other capital ships in a potential direct confrontation against an enemy fleet. During World War I, however, Japan's participation in large-scale naval combat was limited. Conflict in the Pacific remained relatively contained. Throughout this period, Yamashiro primarily conducted patrol and presence missions, including operations along the Chinese coast. These deployments were less about combat and more about asserting Japanese influence across the region. One of the most notable episodes of her early career occurred in 1923. On September 1st of that year, the Great Kantō Earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama. The destruction was catastrophic. Thousands perished and entire cities were consumed by fires and structural collapse. The Imperial Japanese Navy rapidly mobilized its fleet to assist relief efforts. Yamashiro took part in humanitarian operations, transporting supplies and supporting rescue missions. This moment highlights a lesser-known role of major warships. Beyond instruments of destruction, they could also function as large logistical platforms capable of providing aid during national crises. Throughout the 1920s, the global naval landscape began to change. International agreements such as the Washington Naval Treaty imposed limits on the construction of new battleships. Japan, though a signatory, sought ways to preserve competitiveness within these restrictions. It was during the 1930s that Yamashiro underwent profound transformation. Between 1930 and 1935, the ship received an extensive modernization. Her armor protection was reinforced. Her propulsion system was upgraded with new boilers and turbines, improving efficiency and performance. Anti-aircraft defenses were expanded to counter the growing threat posed by military aviation. And perhaps most iconic of all, her superstructure was completely rebuilt. The result was the famous pagoda mast configuration. This towering, vertically layered structure gave Yamashiro a distinctive silhouette. It allowed improved placement of fire control systems and observation platforms, expanding visibility while integrating modern optical and targeting equipment. A ship conceived before World War I was now attempting to adapt to an increasingly technological form of warfare, one increasingly dominated by aircraft power. Yet despite these upgrades, Yamashiro retained inherent structural limitations. Her fundamental design remained that of a battleship from the 1910s. While newer generations of warships emerged worldwide, Yamashiro was essentially a modernization of an earlier concept. Even so, she would continue serving for decades, until being committed to the most dramatic confrontation of her existence. That confrontation would come during one of the most intense naval engagements of World War II in the Pacific, the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944. But before reaching that decisive night, it is necessary to understand the path that led Yamashiro there: the strategic ambitions of Imperial Japan, the early campaigns of the war, and the gradual erosion of Japanese naval supremacy. When Yamashiro emerged from her modernization in the 1930s, she was no longer the same ship launched in 1915. Her silhouette had changed dramatically. The towering pagoda-style superstructure, tall, complex, almost labyrinthine, rose above the deck like a layered steel tower. This structure was not an aesthetic choice, but Japan's attempt to adapt a First World War battleship to the demands of an increasingly technological era of warfare. The modernization aimed to address 3 central challenges: protection, mobility, and anti-aircraft defense. Armor protection was reinforced, particularly against submarine attacks and aerial bombs. The original boilers were replaced with more efficient models, improving operational range. Above all, anti-aircraft armament was expanded, though, like many ships of the period, it would ultimately prove insufficient against the rapid evolution of military aviation. At this time, Japan was moving toward an increasingly aggressive expansionist policy. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the escalation of war against China beginning in 1937 demonstrated the empire's determination to dominate East Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy played a central role in this strategy, protecting supply routes and projecting military power across vast maritime regions. Although already considered a veteran battleship, Yamashiro remained active within the combined fleet. She formed part of Japan's traditional battle force, designed for a decisive confrontation with the United States Navy, a deeply rooted strategic concept within Japanese naval doctrine known as the decisive battle theory. According to this doctrine, in the event of war with the United States, the American fleet would advance across the Pacific while being gradually weakened by submarine and air attacks, until finally confronting Japan's main battle line of battleships in a massive artillery engagement. It was a vision that still placed battleships at the center of naval power. But the reality of the Second World War would challenge this concept brutally. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, officially opening the Pacific War against the United States, Yamashiro did not directly participate in the operation. Instead, the early dominance of naval warfare fell to Japanese aircraft carriers, a historical irony for a navy that continued to value its battleships so highly. During the early years of the war, Yamashiro performed support and training roles. She conducted patrol missions and helped defend strategic areas within Japan's expanding defensive perimeter. Unlike newer and faster battleships such as those of the Yamato-class, Yamashiro was no longer considered ideal for frontline operations and fast-moving carrier warfare. As the conflict progressed, the strategic situation became increasingly unfavorable for Japan. The defeat at Midway in 1942 marked a decisive turning point. From that moment onward, the United States seized the initiative, advancing island by island toward the Japanese home islands. American air superiority expanded rapidly. U.S. submarines inflicted devastating losses on Japanese merchant shipping. Fuel supplies grew dangerously scarce. Every major warship now had to be employed with extreme caution. For much of this period, Yamashiro remained in Japanese waters or assigned to secondary missions. She was absent from many of the great carrier battles that determined the outcome of the Central Pacific Campaign. That would change dramatically in 1944. By then, Japan faced an existential strategic crisis. American forces were approaching the Philippines, a region critical to Japan's supply routes from Southeast Asia. Losing the Philippines would effectively sever access to vital resources, especially oil. It was under these desperate circumstances that the Imperial Japanese Navy planned one of its most ambitious and risky operations, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Within this massive operation, Yamashiro was assigned to the so-called Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. Their mission was to advance through the Surigao Strait under cover of darkness and attack American forces supporting the landings at Leyte. It would be an extremely dangerous passage, a narrow strait bordered by islands ideal for ambush. And waiting on the other side was an American force fully prepared, equipped with advanced radar and experienced in night combat. At that moment, Yamashiro, launched in 1915 and modernized in the 1930s, was about to enter the most decisive and final battle of her existence. In October 1944, Japan's strategic situation had become critical. American forces had launched the invasion of the Philippines on October 20, landing on the island of Leyte. For Tokyo, this was not merely another enemy offensive, it was a direct threat to the supply routes that kept the empire alive. Without oil from Southeast Asia, Japan's entire war machine would grind to a halt. The response was Operation Shogo 1, a complex and highly risky plan involving multiple naval forces converging on Leyte. The concept was simple in theory but desperate in execution. Lure portions of the American fleet away from the landing area while powerful surface forces attacked the ships supporting the invasion. Yamashiro was assigned to the Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. This formation also included her sister ship Fusō, along with cruisers and destroyers. Their mission was to pass through the Surigao Strait during the night of October 24 to 25 and strike American forces inside Leyte Gulf. From the beginning, however, the plan carried obvious weaknesses. The Southern Force would have to navigate a long, narrow strait bordered by islands, leaving little room for maneuver. It was ideal terrain for an ambush, and the Americans knew exactly where the Japanese would appear. Waiting at the northern end of the strait was a powerful American battle line under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Among his ships were veteran battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor and later rebuilt, including USS West Virginia, now equipped with advanced radar fire control systems. It was a symbolic confrontation. On one side stood Yamashiro, a battleship launched in 1915, modernized yet still largely dependent on traditional optical targeting systems. On the other were American battleships capable of detecting and engaging targets in total darkness using radar-guided precision. On the night of October 24, 1944, the Southern force advanced through the strait in column formation, Yamashiro following behind Fusō. Visibility was poor. Tension aboard the ships was intense. After years spent largely away from major combat, the aging battleship was finally approaching the decisive engagement long envisioned by Japanese naval doctrine. What the Japanese commanders did not realize was that American destroyers and PT boats were already positioned along the strait. As the Japanese ships advanced, they came under successive torpedo attacks launched from coordinated ambushes. Fusō was struck and catastrophically damaged. Historical accounts suggest she eventually broke apart and sank after multiple hits. Despite the growing chaos, Yamashiro continued forward. Even under attack, Admiral Nishimura chose to press on. That decision sealed the fate of the force. When Yamashiro reached the northern end of the strait, she encountered one of the most famous naval maneuvers in history, crossing the T. The American battle line lay perpendicular to the Japanese column, allowing every American battleship to fire full broadsides while the Japanese ships could respond only with their forward guns. It was a tactical concept studied since the 19th century, now executed with 20th century technology. American battleships opened fire using radar guidance. USS West Virginia was among the first to shoot, quickly followed by the rest of the line. Heavy shells streaked through the darkness, illuminating the night sky with flashes of gunfire. Yamashiro was hit repeatedly. Explosions shook her hull. Fire spread across the decks. Critical systems failed. Still, she attempted to return fire with her 356mm guns, aiming toward the distant flashes of American artillery. But the technological gap proved decisive. Without comparable radar, already weakened by earlier torpedo attacks and subjected to concentrated gunfire, Yamashiro suffered escalating and catastrophic damage. Additional torpedoes struck the ship. Her speed dropped. The list increased. Shortly after 4 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Yamashiro capsized and sank in the Surigao Strait. Of the more than 1,600 men aboard, only a small number survived. The Battle of Surigao Strait became the final direct engagement between opposing battleship battle lines in naval history. Yamashiro was both among the last battleships to fight in such a confrontation, and one of the last to be destroyed by a traditional battle line. It marked the end of an era. The ship launched in 1915, modernized in the 1930s, and shaped by decades of strategic transformation met her end in a battle that symbolized the closing chapter of battleship dominance. Yet the story of Yamashiro does not end with her sinking. Her fate echoes as a symbol of naval warfare's definitive transition, from the supremacy of the gun to the supremacy of radar, from battle lines to carrier aviation, and from surface duels to the age of technological warfare at sea. When Yamashiro disappeared beneath the waters of the Surigao Strait in the early hours of October 25, 1944, something greater than a single warship was lost. What sank that night was the symbol of an entire era of naval warfare. The Battle of Surigao Strait formed part of the immense Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history in terms of scale. Yet within that vast operation, what unfolded in the narrow, dark waters of the strait was unique. It marked the last direct confrontation between opposing battleship battle lines ever fought. For decades, naval strategists had envisioned decisive clashes between columns of heavily armed ships exchanging artillery salvos across the horizon. This vision shaped ship design, military budgets, and naval doctrine around the world. Yamashiro itself had been born from that very mindset. But by 1944 the world had already changed. What determined Yamashiro's fate was not merely the caliber of American guns, but the technology guiding them. Radar allowed U.S. battleships to detect and engage the Japanese force in darkness with devastating accuracy. While Japanese crews relied largely on visual observation and illumination shells, the Americans were already fighting in a new dimension, one invisible to the human eye. The execution of the classic crossing the T maneuver by the American battle line represented an ancient tactic empowered by modern technology. Yet even in that moment, it was clear that the future of naval warfare would no longer belong to battleship formations. Elsewhere in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the decisive factor was carrier aviation. American aircraft struck Japanese forces hundreds of kilometers away. Air superiority rendered even the most powerful battleships vulnerable long before they could approach enemy fleets. Yamashiro thus became a casualty of two eras at once: the tradition of surface battle and the technological revolution that was making such engagements increasingly obsolete. The strategic consequences were profound. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful offensive force. Losses in ships, fuel reserves, and experienced crews proved irreparable. The blockade around Japan tightened, supply routes collapsed, and strategic initiative passed permanently to the United States. Ironically, Yamashiro, designed for the long-anticipated decisive battle against the American fleet, ultimately encountered that battle under completely unfavorable conditions. Japanese doctrine had envisioned gradually weakening the enemy before the final confrontation. At Surigao Strait, however, it was the Japanese force that arrived exhausted, fragmented, and predictable. There is an unavoidable historical irony. Launched in 1915 when the world still operated under the logic of colonial empires and battleship supremacy, Yamashiro was destroyed in a war dominated by aircraft, submarines, and radar. She had served during the First World War patrolling Chinese waters. She delivered humanitarian aid after the Great Kantō Earthquake of 1923. She underwent extensive modernization in the 1930s, gaining her iconic pagoda mast superstructure. And she met her end during one of the most decisive nights in naval history. Few warships passed through so many distinct phases of modern warfare. Yamashiro represents the transition between two military worlds, the age of battleship supremacy and the rise of air power and technological warfare. She stands as a reminder that no weapon, however dominant it may appear, remains supreme forever. War evolves, technology advances, and the symbols of one era become relics of the next. On the seabed of the Surigao Strait, Yamashiro's hull rests as a silent witness to an irreversible historical transformation, the end of the Great Battle Line era and the definitive birth of modern naval warfare. When Yamashiro was launched in 1915, the world still believed that a nation's strength could be measured by the number and caliber of its battleships. The great powers competed in tons of steel, artillery range, and armor thickness. Japan, rising, ambitious, and determined, sought to prove it deserved a place among the world's great naval powers, and Yamashiro was part of that declaration. But history rarely respects the certainties of the present. Over nearly 3 decades of service, Yamashiro lived through transformations that completely reshaped naval warfare. She was born in the age of the telegraph and met her end in the age of radar. Designed for tightly coordinated fleet engagements, she ultimately fought in a night battle guided by invisible technology. Her iconic pagoda-style superstructure, added during the major modernizations of the 1930s, became one of the most recognizable visual symbols of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That towering structure was not merely aesthetic. It represented an attempt to adapt an aging battleship to a new era defined by advanced fire control, aerial observation, and increasingly complex communication systems. Yet no modernization could change one essential fact. Yamashiro was fundamentally a product of 1915. During the First World War, she patrolled the Chinese coast in a conflict where Japan played only a limited role in the primary European theater. In 1923, she aided her own people following the devastating Great Kantō Earthquake, demonstrating that warships could also serve as instruments of national relief in times of catastrophe. Throughout the 1930s, she witnessed Japan's expansion across continental Asia and the transformation of the empire into an increasingly militarized power. And when the Second World War erupted in the Pacific, Yamashiro remained part of a battle fleet that still believed in battleship supremacy. But the oceans already belonged to aircraft carriers. The decisive battles of the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine campaigns, were fought largely through carrier-based air power. Battleships increasingly became supporting elements within carrier task forces. Even the Imperial Japanese Navy came to rely primarily on aviation as its offensive spearhead. And yet, in October 1944, Yamashiro was called upon to perform exactly the mission for which she had been built, advancing in battle line formation against an enemy force in a strategic strait. What unfolded in the Surigao Strait was more than a tactical engagement. It was the final collision between two eras. The American battle line, equipped with radar, executed the classic maneuver of crossing the T, but with a technological precision unimaginable to early 20th century naval theorists. Yamashiro answered with determination and discipline, yet without the technological advantage required to survive. When she capsized and sank into the dark waters, it was not merely a ship that vanished. It marked the symbolic end of the age in which battleship lines determined the fate of nations. From that moment onward, no major naval battle would again be decided solely by opposing lines of heavy guns. Air power and electronic technology had assumed command of the seas. Yamashiro endures in history as a bridge between worlds, a warship born under the logic of the First World War and destroyed amid the brutal modernity of the Second. Her story is a lesson in adaptation, in the limits of technology, and in how military doctrines can become obsolete faster than their creators ever imagined. On the seabed of the Surigao Strait, she rests as a silent witness to the definitive transition of naval warfare. If we look at Yamashiro's complete timeline, it becomes clear that few warships passed through so many distinct phases of modern history within a single hull. She was born at the height of the naval arms race that preceded the First World War, constructed at a time when Japan was still consolidating its identity as an imperial power. In 1915, when she first slid into the sea, the world was dominated by European colonial empires, and battleships represented the ultimate expression of military strength. During the First World War, Yamashiro did not fight in major fleet engagements. Japan's role focused largely on securing maritime routes and expanding regional influence. For the battleship, those years were defined by patrol duties and strategic presence, particularly in Chinese waters, a quiet but unmistakable demonstration of power. In 1923, when the Great Kantō Earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, Yamashiro took part in relief operations. That moment revealed an often overlooked truth. Warships can also serve as national instruments in times of disaster. Designed for combat, she instead became a logistical platform and symbol of stability amid catastrophe. During the 1930s, extensive modernization transformed her appearance and extended her operational life. The famous pagoda-style superstructure was more than visual distinction. It represented an effort to preserve relevance in an era of rapid technological change. Fire control systems were upgraded, anti-aircraft defenses strengthened, and protection improved. Yet no modernization could alter the essence of her original design. By the time the Second World War began in the Pacific, Yamashiro was already a veteran. She was absent from the carrier battles that ultimately determined the course of the war. She did not participate in Pearl Harbor, Midway, or the major carrier engagements that define naval combat in the Pacific. And that absence is meaningful. While global perception still associated naval supremacy with massive battleships, reality proved that air power had fundamentally changed warfare at sea. Capital ships increasingly became vulnerable to aircraft and submarines. But in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fate placed Yamashiro into precisely the type of confrontation for which she had been built, a nighttime advance toward an enemy battle line under the doctrine of the decisive fleet engagement. In the Surigao Strait, she faced modernized American battleships equipped with advanced radar systems. Their tradition and technology collided. The classic maneuver of crossing the T was executed against her. Radar-guided fire struck through the darkness. Torpedoes launched by American destroyers had already shattered her formation. Under concentrated gunfire, the aging battleship could not survive. Shortly after 4 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Yamashiro capsized and sank. More than 1,600 men were aboard. Only a small number survived. The Battle of Surigao Strait entered history as the final engagement between opposing battleship lines. After that night, naval warfare would never again be decided in such a manner. Yamashiro was therefore more than a Japanese warship. She became the symbolic closing chapter of the battleship era as the unquestioned ruler of the seas. Her hull now rests on the seabed of the strait as a historical marker, a reminder that every form of military supremacy is temporary, that strategic doctrine must evolve, and that warfare inevitably overtakes those unable to adapt to its pace. Yamashiro began her life in a world that believed in the supremacy of the gun. She ended it in a world dominated by radar, aviation, and invisible technology. And her entire journey tells the story of that transition. When Yamashiro sank beneath the dark waters of the Surigao Strait in the early hours of October 25, 1944, it was not merely a battleship that disappeared. What vanished with her was a strategic belief that had dominated the world's oceans for more than half a century. Since the late 19th century, the great powers had invested enormous resources in building battleships. They were national symbols, diplomatic instruments, and the backbone of any fleet aspiring to global status. When Japan launched Yamashiro in 1915, it was declaring its intention to compete at that level. The ship represented ambition, industrial capability, and strategic vision. During the First World War, she patrolled Asian waters as part of Japan's growing regional influence. In 1923, she assisted her own nation after the devastating Great Kantō Earthquake, demonstrating that even machines of war could serve national recovery. In the 1930s, extensive modernization gave her the unmistakable pagoda-style superstructure, a visual icon of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the world changed faster than steel could adapt. The Second World War proved that air power and electronic technology had fundamentally transformed naval warfare. Aircraft carriers began deciding battles hundreds of kilometers away. Submarines became invisible threats beneath the surface. Radar removed darkness as an ally. And yet, Yamashiro entered her final battle according to an older logic. Advance in formation, confront the enemy directly, and exchange heavy artillery fire. In the Surigao Strait, tradition met modernity, and lost. The American battle line, guided by radar, executed the classic crossing the T maneuver with devastating precision. Yamashiro fought back. Her guns fired into the night. But the technological and tactical superiority opposing her was overwhelming. When she capsized and sank, it was not only a Japanese warship going down. It was the final echo of the great battleship engagements that had begun in the era of the First World War. After that night, no traditional clash between opposing battleship lines would ever occur again. Yamashiro lived through 3 distinct eras. She was born under the doctrine of battleship supremacy. She was modernized in an attempt to survive technological revolution. And she died in a world dominated by radar, aircraft, and electronic warfare. Her hull resting on the seabed is more than historical wreckage. It is a marker of transition, a reminder that no weapon remains dominant forever, that strategy must evolve, and that even giants of steel can become relics in the face of change. The story of Yamashiro is not simply the story of a ship. It is the story of the transformation of naval warfare in the 20th century. If you enjoyed this deep, detailed, and historically grounded analysis, consider leaving a like. It helps the channel continue producing long-form, carefully researched documentaries. And if you want to keep exploring real naval and military history, understanding not only battles but the strategic decisions and technological shifts that shape the modern world, subscribe to the channel. Here, every video is a deep voyage into history. No myths, no exaggeration, just history well told. See you in the next chapter.